Welcome everyone to our webinar today. We'll go ahead and get started by introducing our presenters. I'm Emily Tichich. I'll be facilitating the session today. For the second half of today's webinar, I'll be joined by three of my colleagues from Leadership and Talent Development to get some important perspectives on common questions in performance management at the U. With me here are Brandon Sullivan, Senior Director of LTD, Donna Sadoff, Senior LTD Consultant, and Christina McGuire, LTD Consultant. While you're listening today, and for a more active learning experience, you can use the action sheet we provided for you in the reminder email, or you can download it now by going to the link on the screen, z.umn.edu/actionsheet. The formatting works best if you open it in Microsoft Word. Use it to follow along, jot down notes. This also becomes your takeaway to help reinforce learning and something you can reference later. Don't worry about filling it out completely during the webinar. You can always refer to it later. I'll point out other opportunities for you to use the action sheet. You can also look for the icon on the slide, which will prompt you to use it, and you can see the icon there right in front of you now. Great, so now that we've gotten through the housekeeping, let's move into our topic. Welcome everyone, welcome again. Thank you for attending our webinar today on performance management. It's going to be a good one. So, as we asked earlier in the chat, what comes to mind when you hear performance management? If you haven't already, please go ahead and type your ideas into the chat now. Great. Conversation, yes. Performance evaluations, absolutely. Communication, good. I like to see that communication. Yes. Professional development, good. Accomplishments, good. Thinking about those goals. Coaching and feedback, good. Helping folks be successful. Mentorship, good. I like to see that too. Awesome, and if you want to, you can scroll through to see what your other participant colleagues have also been chatting. Retention, oh, very nice. Accountability, good. Thanks everyone. Let's move to our objectives today for today's session. The goal of this webinar for performance management is first to explore why this is so hard, and of course, what is the reality of performance management at the U, and what are the main challenges facing U of M supervisors. We'll also spend some time identifying some of the best practices of what works in performance management. And then, of course, the most important thing is what can you do? And so we'll start thinking about the ways you can take action to improve performance management for you, your department, or unit. And it's at that point, in the third part, what can you do, that will bring in the experts to help us work through some common issues. So, performance management at the U. Why is this so hard? Here are some of the themes we've heard about in recent years. People have told us it's a burdensome administrative process that's required. Yeah. Supervisors tell us they take a lot of time creating annual goals only to see them become irrelevant or outdated. Yep, that's a big one. Supervisors don't know how to rate employees without it leading to a very challenging and defensive conversation. We also hear that sometimes department forms or systems are complex and confusing, and they take a long time to fill out. So that's a lot of effort. We also hear supervisors don't know how to keep their high-performing employees motivated. That's very common. In addition, supervisors don't want to appear like they're favoring certain people. Sometimes that gets in the way of an honest evaluation. And of course, supervisors, the biggest one, they feel like they just don't have time. While all of these are very valid and very real reasons why performance management can be ineffective and frustrating at the U, there is an underlying reason that we need to look at. And I wonder if this takes you by surprise. Fear of conflict. Fear of conflict can be an underlying reason why performance management feels ineffective. It's easy to fall into these excuses about avoiding performance management because it's our natural desire to avoid conflict. There's an unspoken culture here at the U to avoid conflict, and sometimes people perpetuate this without even realizing it. This avoidance feeds into weak performance management for two reasons. First, giving critical feedback is hard, right? People get defensive, and so it's tempting to tolerate a problematic behavior, and that might sound familiar to you. Second, giving positive feedback to some and not others feels like singling people out. These are both valid concerns. So, does this mean we should not manage performance? Well, obviously that's a rhetorical question. Of course not, but what works? And so that's what we're going to move into now. How can you make a process easier and more effective without perpetuating this culture of conflict avoidance? At this point, we have a chat question for you. True or false? Writing and delivering a better performance review will help improve performance. So if you would, please, in the chat box now, please type true if you agree with the statement and false if you disagree. Oh, I see lots of true, possibly. I see lots of trues and some falses too. Maybe, yeah. Question is ambiguous. Yeah, we apologize for that. We think it's a good question. Maybe it appears ambiguous. Okay, at this point, you've had a chance to think about this and think about your true or false. So in order to think about this, if you said true, we see where you're coming from. But if you said false, you're right. Why? Because the evaluation or review is the last stop in the process. By the time you get there, you can't improve. Imagine a friend of yours was training for a marathon, and the bulk of their training regimen involved practicing crossing the finish line. Sounds weird, right? What would you think? It probably seems a little silly to practice the last step of the race before training for the 26 miles before that moment. So can you see the connection with this metaphor to performance management? The performance review is the last step in the process of performance management. There are many steps that come before that influence performance. I hope that makes sense. Let's look at these steps and what are some practices that have really been proven to work. If you watched our previous webinar or a short video that we sent out in the registration email, you already know that effective performance management involves 3 stages. Goal setting, there on the left, ongoing check-in conversations, and finally the performance evaluation. It may seem like it's more work, but it's work that is evenly distributed throughout the year and not a spike at the end when you're struggling to remember the goals to write up the review, and that might sound familiar too. If you haven't already, you might want to refer to your action sheet. Let's take a look at what works and what are some common missteps of each of these 3 phases. In goal setting, what works? Setting 3 to 5 broad goals at the beginning of the year and setting short-term goals throughout the year based on the nature of the work. Next, this allows goals to be flexible as priorities might change throughout the year, so having flexible goals. Finally, make sure that goals are challenging so the progress is meaningful. These goals can be attained but will require significant effort, so challenging and meaningful. Think about whether these goals would allow for learning and feedback to develop and grow. We have a quick guide to goal setting that goes into more details about the process of goal setting, how to set goals so they provide foundation for coaching and feedback for the upcoming year. And I'm sure a lot of you are already in touch with that, but if not, check out our quick guide. What doesn't work in goal setting? Well, this one seems obvious, but I think it's worth saying. Don't forget to set goals. Next, don't make goals that are too easy. These would be like your kind of check the box tasks. And also include goals, and including goals that are not challenging enough to support growth and development. So kind of the opposite of what we just looked at. Thirdly, and this might come as a surprise, keep in mind that SMART goals as annual goals aren't always appropriate. They sometimes focus on results that aren't meaningful, that are changed too quickly, and consequently are forgotten. What happens is over-engineered goals can become outdated in less time than it took to create them. Let's move on to check-ins. Check-ins are a huge component of performance management. So what actually works? This is simple. Don't overthink it. So as you see on the slide there, first is frequent. And I know we say this all the time, but weekly to monthly. For most units or colleges at the U, the best practice is to have weekly check-ins. And I think why can be very clear. If that doesn't make sense for your direct reports, check-ins should occur monthly at a minimum. Second, revisiting and updating goals during these check-ins. And then, of course, discussing progress and expectations. Finally, offering support and coaching. So that's what works with check-ins. And again, I hope what you're seeing on the screen or on the slide there is a lot of what you're already doing and some of that common sense, because having regular check-ins is important. As I said, best practice really is weekly. If that amount seems overwhelming, that's really an opportunity to find a more effective method that works for you in your direct reports that still involves regular check-ins. We do have a quick guide to assessing performance, potential, and readiness to help you do this. So if you haven't checked that out, again, it's the quick guide to assessing performance, potential, and readiness. In this case, you might want to focus your check-ins around sustaining, reinforcing, and recognizing performance and developing skills that would help your high potential employees tackle a more complex project or assignment. Regarding what doesn't work with check-ins, and this is just some reminders. First, not having any conversations other than the annual review. This is an easy thing to fall into. It doesn't work. It doesn't make check-ins effective. Second, avoiding candid feedback. Check-ins are a time for honesty. And third, of course, focusing only on problem performers. This is a big one. It doesn't work to spend most of your time as a supervisor on the poor performers. This is what a lot of people do because it seems necessary. But this is not effort well spent. Take a look at your high performers. These are the people that already are very engaged and committed to do their work. Do they have capacity to develop skills needed for a larger role? Or take on more complex projects and assignments? In other words, assess them for their potential. Let's take a minute here and see why addressing development is important. As we've already mentioned, there's a tendency to focus on a problem performance, but it's crucial to remember to attend to your high-performing, high potentials, because if you don't, this is important, if you don't, research tells us they will eventually leave. For example, a survey done by the Center for Creative Leadership showed that while high potentials are more engaged in their work, they might also be actively seeking other employment opportunities. This particular survey found that 33% of informally identified high potentials actively seek new employment versus 14% of formally identified. So the takeaway is that recognizing them as a high potential is important. The more high potentials are aware that you see them as high potential and able to take on more responsibility, the more likely they are to stay. Also, think about kinds of opportunities you provide for high potentials. It's not only about the monetary rewards. It can also include progressively more complex assignments, exposure to leadership opportunities and leaders, more flexibility. In fact, money's not the main motivator for most high potentials. More important is getting greater responsibility, having opportunities to do interesting work that has an impact, and that makes sense, doesn't it? Learning about their interests and aspirations can help to provide opportunities that retain and motivate high potential direct reports. I hope that makes sense. Okay, to sum up, the first two stages of performance management, goal setting and check-ins, is what makes performance management effective in the first place. This is where the bulk of the work happens, setting meaningful goals, adjusting as we go, having productive coaching conversations. The last step there is what is commonly thought of as performance management, and in fact is a performance review, that evaluation. So let's take a look at what some of these best practices are. Performance evaluation is the final step of the process. So in essence, back to our metaphor, you've made it to the finish line. Here's what works. Giving feedback throughout the year. I know you know this already. Next, evaluating accomplishments and impact of the direct report's actions. That's important. So not just looking at what they did, but what the impact was too. Third, getting input from the employee and other key stakeholders on their perspectives on their accomplishments. Lastly, using specific examples to evaluate how they achieved their results. This is where the check-ins can be helpful because it's difficult to remember all the details of someone's work. Check-ins give you regular opportunity to revisit and become familiar with their goals and performance. Here's what doesn't work in performance evaluation. I like this one. It's so important. Feedback should never be a surprise. If the feedback is new, that means the employee didn't hear it or it wasn't delivered. If the evaluation is too complicated, it doesn't work. Some examples are if the form is too long, if there are too many behavioral competencies being evaluated, or if there are too many steps in the evaluation process. Next, self-ratings for employees don't always work because they create defensiveness and they can distract from talking about performance. Lastly, it also doesn't work if tools drive performance evaluation. The tech can't correct a poor process. It's always important to design the process that works first, before bringing in the tech to support it. The best processes are simple and based on these best practices. In the spirit of simplifying the performance review form, we at SDC are working on a simple 2-page form that will be available university-wide. It will be available soon, so stay tuned. Also, in the quick guide to performance evaluation, we give more information about the steps in writing and delivering performance evaluation, including some of the important context and how to address some of the common challenges. So if you haven't checked out that quick guide, you can do that too. Great, so at this point, we know about these best practices. Of course, I think the reason you're attending this webinar is because you want to manage performance more effectively. We all do. We also want to have more meaningful conversations with our direct reports. So what gets in the way? In other words, why aren't we just doing it? We have a quick multi-question poll for you. So there's 4 questions. The questions are, what happens if you don't, number 1, write and deliver annual performance review? Number 2, what happens if you don't have regular check-ins? Number 3, what happens if you don't have quality check-ins? And number 4, what happens if you don't set meaningful goals? So your choices are A, nothing happens, B, my supervisor follows up with me, C, it affects my performance evaluation, and D, it affects my career opportunities. Okay, so if you would please answer as honestly as you can in the poll. Okay, you should be able to see the results there on your screen, and you can see that many of you have responded in many different ways. Nothing happens, or your supervisor follows up with you, or it affects your performance evaluation or your career opportunities, positively or negatively. Great. One of the things I hope that comes to the surface here is, depending on what department or unit you're in, there isn't always built-in accountability for any of these, except number 1. So number 1 will definitely be the time that any supervisor or any manager would notice if you haven't written and delivered your annual performance review. So in other words, if you don't do 2, 3, or 4, again, depending on what department or unit you're in, there may not be any accountability for that. This is why performance management can be seen as difficult. If you do have regular or quality check-ins, there isn't always recognition for this, so it's very challenging. There may not be that built-in accountability, like I said, in your college or in your unit. So it's up to you as a supervisor to hold to these best practices, because that's what effective performance management looks like. And you owe it to yourself and your direct reports to learn how to provide this, or to continue learning how to provide this. At this point in our webinar, as I mentioned earlier, we have some people here to speak with us about some of these topics. And the question, of course, is what can you do? So we're going to turn it over to our experts, Donna, Christina, and Brandon. They're going to answer your questions that have come from feedback and evaluations about performance management. And they'll give you tips on how to implement that, that what works in your current supervisory role. Currently, 3 of them are part of a system-wide talent and performance management working group that is looking at how to improve performance management practices at the U. Before we get started, can any of you tell us a little bit about the focus of the group's work?
Sure, I can speak to that a little bit. So currently, and many employees at the university actually don't know this, performance management is determined locally. So the form that you use for your performance review, the tools and the process that you use, whether you use a technology platform or not, that's determined at the local level. And so that creates a lot of different practices, some of which are effective, some of which maybe aren't. And there's been a lot of advances in the last few years in performance management and our understanding in the world of what works and what doesn't. And so this group is coming together. It's a group of HR directors across the system, and we're part of that, to really identify what are some common practices that we could put in place system-wide to improve performance management, make it more effective, maybe less painful, that kind of thing.
Thank you, and I wonder if that was new for a lot of our listeners, that performance management is something that's developed on a local level. That's important to remember. Great, thank you. So while we're listening from our experts, I would encourage you participants to feel free to submit any questions you have in the Q&A so we can address whatever it is that you're wondering about. So Donna, if we can, we'll start with you.
Sure.
So one of the questions that a lot of people have asked over the years that we hear about in the evaluations and feedback is there's clearly, like based on what we talked about today, what we've talked about in previous sessions, there's clearly a lot to think about when we think about performance management. But I think one thing that people can get stuck on is like, I want to do all of this, but I have to kind of start somewhere. So if, in your opinion, where would you encourage people to start?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, That's a great question, Emily. Thank you. So I think that the one thing that really can be a game changer for supervisors and employees is based on the quality of the conversations between the two of them. And one of the purposes of a performance review is to check in with an employee if you're a supervisor. But this conversation is not terribly helpful if the only time you do it is in, April or May of each year. So, and you spoke to this earlier, but I really think those ongoing conversations throughout the year is the cornerstone of performance management. I believe if you do that well, the rest will sort of fall into place. And so it allows supervisors to get in the habit of checking in with their employees and the progress toward their goals, how they align with the broader department team goals. It's also a chance to level set with employees about what's going well for them, what they'd like to improve. But the other thing is, it's a great opportunity for a supervisor to ask the employee how the supervisor, is actually doing, how they can help, and just invite suggestions for ways in which they might do something better. And that might not be something that supervisors are used to at this point, but it is helpful, and it helps create more of a two-way conversation. It's not all the supervisor talking with the employee. And then just one more thing I want to mention is, one of the most stressful, or potentially one of the most stressful and disengaging things for employees is to not have clarity about what's expected of them, and to not get feedback about how they're doing. So just really developing that ongoing practice of having, and you mentioned weekly, even I'll just say periodically, I think is really so important.
I think everything you're saying makes sense, and probably to our participants too makes a lot of sense. It's very common sense. We know it's best practice.
Yeah.
So why don't, in your opinion, and this is kind of looking for a little bit of solidarity, why don't people do this? What gets in the way of them having these conversations? It sounds like such common sense.
I would say it's simple but not easy. And it is developing a new behavior, which, as we know, always feels really uncomfortable at first. And you mentioned a bit about this earlier too, about why people don't do it. When you're developing something new, it feels a little intimidating at first. I don't know how to talk to my employee, a supervisor might think, or they might think they have to do it perfectly, or they're gonna somehow the employee's going to misinterpret what they're saying. Or honestly, I'm guessing what a lot of the supervisors online right now are thinking is, when do I have time to do this?
Of course, yeah.
Especially if they're feeling overloaded already. But I think it's super important, and it's actually a really good investment in time. Think about the stress of doing a pile of performance reviews in April or May, and then think about sort of having those paced a bit more throughout the course of the year. And it actually becomes a less stressful event then, because at the end then you're just summarizing these conversations. And also, another thing that gets in the way is, we kind of touched on it earlier, conflict avoidance.
I was just thinking about that. It really comes naturally to have conversations with some of your direct reports because of the type of personalities or familiarity or friendliness that you might share with them. Could you say a word about how, what is it that supervisors need to be thinking about when they're thinking about those direct reports that they work with that are a little bit more, there's a little bit maybe more conflict or more difficulty in kind of getting that conversation going with them. Kind of, it doesn't feel so easy or simple.
That's right. No, that's another really good question. And I think one of the most important pieces to it is that if there can be clarity with regard to expectations. And so the supervisor really needs to think about, okay, this is what the employee's responsible, here's what I expect, and then help clarify that with the employee so that at least they're on the same page there. If the conflict is about how they're doing it, that's another conversation. But I think just the what is the most important thing to clarify at first.
Great.
And just for the supervisor to be well prepared for the conversation. Put them at ease.
Yes, I think you totally hit the nail on the head there. It's not just about kind of going with it. It's about preparing, thinking about what you want to say.
You don't want to wing it.
No, especially until it becomes that habit.
That's right.
And then it becomes a little bit more natural.
Exactly.
Thank you, Donna. I'm sure there are supervisors in our audience today are thinking well, what if this or what if that? So I would encourage supervisors to write those questions into the Q&A, and then we'll address those at the end of our panel. Sounds good. Thank you, Donna. Christina, one of the questions that I was hoping that you could talk about today, based on your experience and your expertise here at the U, is, again, something that a lot of supervisors have asked us about in many different ways. So this question can take many different versions, but basically what it gets down to is, what does performance management look like when it's done well?
Sure.
Could you talk to that?
Yeah,
Great.
absolutely. So effective performance management is about managing the performance. So it really starts with the foundational aspects that we've been talking about and that Donna elaborated on, as far as like setting the goals, making sure that you know what success looks like and that's shared with your employee. It's about the quick check-ins throughout the year, and then it's also about the evaluation at the end of the year. But to be even more successful and more effective performance management, it's about differentiation of talent. So it's about supervisors really understanding their talent pool. So which employees are the high performers, which employees are the average, really solid performers, and then which employees are the lower performers as well. And then understanding and intentionally supporting the different levels of talent. Often a lot of time and energy is spent on the low performers and handling those issues, where effective performance management is more about shifting that focus and that energy across and making sure that high performers are also supported as well. And then along with that too, it is taking the conversation about performance management beyond just that rating or that label that goes with the rating. So it is providing that narrative and that communication, which we saw a lot in the chat about performance management, and Donna spoke to as well about the quick check-ins and the ongoing check-ins throughout the year. So it's having those conversations, providing the context, the opportunity to provide feedback, as well as just the rating itself.
Thank you. So it sounds again like the importance of that conversation that feeds into the narration, which feeds into a very effective performance management evaluation.
Yes.
Could you speak, I think this is kind of a new concept it could be a new concept for a lot of our audience, that idea of how much time you're spending on your poor performers or high performers. Could you talk a little about why you think that we are drawn to always, kind of using our efforts with our low performers, and why it's important to, and we talked about this already in the session, but just curious what your thoughts are, why we're addressing the low performers with so much energy, and what it is we need to think about with our high performers as well.
Yeah, so it could just be that the low performers are getting more time and attention because they're the ones causing the conflict, the issues, so it's trying to figure out the best way to minimize the disruption. It could also be an idea of fairness, that you want a supervisor might just be compelled to treat everybody the same way, so they don't want to point out the high performers. But it is important to support and talk about what that support looks like with your high performers. So as we saw some of the data earlier, that you can retain them and you can motivate them, because that's where the good work gets done, because they're high performers. So it's talking about things, opportunities within the work space, connections, exposure to maybe different levels of leadership or different people outside of your specific unit.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's really worth thinking about, kind of more in depth. Another question that I thought you might be able to help us with is, are there examples of what departments here at the U are doing to help develop their employees? And you've touched on a few things already. Do you have anything else you could talk to us about in terms of what departments here at the U are doing to help develop their employees?
Yeah, so at the university, there's a lot of really good practices out there, and some really excellent things being done. It could look like, or examples that we've seen have been communication plans. So having leaders share and define what the communications about performance management is across the year, focusing on certain topics, providing training for supervisors as how to provide feedback, and also some navigation about what to talk about in those conversations, so they become more meaningful in that way.
Great, thank you. So again, if there are any questions coming into our participants' minds at this point based on anything Christina or Donna have said so far, please enter those into the Q&A, and we'll have some time in a few minutes after hearing from Brandon to address those more individual questions. Brandon, thank you for joining us too. One of the questions, based on your expertise and your experience here at the U in your position, one of the questions that we've gotten over the years from our previous participants through evaluations and feedback has been, if they are, it's kind of what to do. If they're currently in a department or unit or college that is practicing a lot of these kind of counter practices that go against a lot of the best practices that we've talked about, I think that can be very demotivating, unmotivating for a lot of our supervisors. And I was just wondering, what you would say to that. What can they do in that kind of situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure there aren't supervisors out there that deal with any sorts of process or system that's kind of a pain, right?
Yeah.
No, that's the classic thing with performance
Of
management,
course.
and the university is no different. There are some practices that are worse than others in terms of taking up time and not yielding results.
Yeah.
So I would sort of say a couple of things. If you look at the short term, so if you're a supervisor and you have a performance management process in your college or your unit that maybe is not aligned with the best practices we just talked about, right? So you're spending time doing things, checking boxes that really don't matter that much, and so on. What you can really do in the short term is focus your time and energy on the things that work. And we just covered those things in this webinar. We know what works, and it's a few simple things around setting big challenging goals, doing ongoing feedback and development coaching, and in the review, really focusing on impact and how that impact came about. So what were the behaviors that the person engaged in that either contributed to or detracted from the performance? And if you focus on those things, then you're going to have a good use of your time, and you're going to elevate the performance of your employees, and you're going to be developing them as well. So then if you focus on that, and there's these other things that you have to do as part of your process that take up your time and energy, just check the box on those. You got to get them done, right? I would never advise a supervisor to not do the process that they have. But don't give them a lot of time and energy. Don't spend time, really complaining about them and ruminating about them and talking about them.
Yeah.
Focus on the things that matter and don't get distracted by the other things. Now in the long run, so that's a short-term solution, right, is to focus on what works and tune out the distractions as much as you can. In the long run, part of the purpose actually of doing webinars like this is to get the knowledge out there of what works and what's effective. We need to get that really in the hands of all of our supervisors so that you can ask good questions, right, locally. Ask your manager, ask your HR team, have conversations with other supervisors. The pain points that managers have around performance management are pretty universal, right? We talk with lots of groups, lots of different areas at the university, academic units, administrative units, all levels. We hear the same frustrations with performance management. And so if you start talking within your unit with other supervisors, you're probably going to hear similar sorts of things. So I think the key in the long term is really to shift the conversation from sort of complaining about what doesn't work and pulling your hair out because you're spending time doing things that are frustrating, and focusing on which of these best practices can you apply in your unit, how might you change your process to simplify it, to focus it on what works, and to cut out the things that don't work. It's very important to do that, but it can take time. If you want to have a change to your review, your performance review in 2020, you're going to have to implement changes like in the next couple of months, because you can't surprise employees with a new process at the end of the year. You've got to start it. So it takes time to do that, but it's really about having those conversations, asking the good questions, using the knowledge to come up with ideas and solutions.
I like the way that you framed that with the short term, what you can do now. And again, a lot of that is based on what we've talked about today, and also into the long term, like what is it you want a year from now or 2 years from now? I think that's really important because we're impatient. I'm impatient. We want to see results today or tomorrow or next week. But we have to remember, too, our context and what we're working with. That brings me to one of the questions, which is, if people do want to raise questions about processes in their department or unit or college, how can they raise those questions in a way that's productive? Because we all complain. All of us, we complain. We raise issues. We talk to our coworkers. We talk to maybe our supervisor. But how do we do this in a way, if we really want to affect change, where do we start? Or what do we do to make that a more productive form of communication?
And this is where everybody vents about performance management, right? We all do it. I've done it. I do it all the time, even in a good process, sometimes. So really, I think the key is getting beyond that and not just focusing on what don't you like, but is really talking with others about what are the specific pain points, what are the things that you're spending time on that are clearly not adding any value, or maybe they're even creating problems. So a good example that comes up every year when we do this is employee self-ratings. Right? If you have employees rate themselves, let's say you use a 1 to 5 scale, if they rate themselves, you are creating a situation that's going to create defensiveness. And that's going to make the review hard, right? It's going to make it harder. Some units have now moved away from that, and they've seen some positive results. Other units have this built into their process, and so it's part of their process. But if you start talking about, well, why is this not helpful, right? Not just complaining about, well, why is this not helpful? How does this detract from the review? So if something creates defensiveness, you're not having a conversation that the employee is going to be receptive to listening to feedback and coaching and development, because they're going to be feeling like they're being attacked, or they're being judged unfairly, or they have to defend their rating. This is just an example, but there's lots of pieces in the process that can do that. So think about that way, and then what are some solutions? So if something is causing a problem or not adding value, what might you do? In some cases, maybe just eliminate it, right? That would be my recommendation with self-ratings. You just get rid of it. Other things, like let's say you have a really long form and you have to rate someone on 35 competencies and then write down all their goals and write down all their, it's this long thing. You still want to have a form, probably, right? But you could simplify it and focus it on what matters, what the person accomplished, on the impact that they had, and a description of maybe a few of the competencies that are really important for their role. So you simplify it.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'm sure that got a lot of our participants, kind of thinking about, ooh, what is it that I can do? What is it that I would like to see changed? And one of the questions that has come up before that you're kind of making me think about is what's the cost of not ever speaking up, or not ever kind of taking the effort to identify, the practices that you're involved with and how they're working?
Yeah.
So what's the cost?
Yeah, it's big,
Yeah.
and there's 2 levels to it.
Okay.
So there's the immediate cost of the time that's wasted going through a process that doesn't add value, that doesn't improve performance, that doesn't improve development, that actually makes people cynical and skeptical about even managing and developing talent, right? So there's that cost, the hours put in, which is probably enormous. Yeah. It is in most institutions. And then there's the cost that's harder to quantify, to the engagement level of your high potentials and high performers, the development that is never realized, right? So if you have people who go through development coaching and a good process, and they learn and they grow and they're engaged, versus there's just a focus on this process that's broken and doesn't work, project that forward a few years, big impact in terms of the engagement level of your workforce. You're probably going to lose your high potentials, because as we know from the engagement work, if you're highly committed but frustrated, you probably aren't going to hang around real long. And so there's a lot of different elements of cost to this, and I would go back to something that Christina talked about in terms of those high performers, high potentials. That's really the cost of a bad process, is you're not engaging them, developing them, and retaining them. And they're a really critical part of the workforce, obviously.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So at this point, I think we'll go into the Q&A from our audience, and we'll continue to address these issues a little bit more specifically to what the questions are today. One of the questions that's come through so far from Betsy is that, like Brandon, I think you might want to address this, is that self-ratings don't work, but the use form has that as part of the form. How should we handle this? And I'm not, maybe about what form she's referring to?
Well, here's where I would clarify, there is no university form. The forms are determined at the local level. That means the college or unit level. And in some cases, multiple units have gotten together and share a form or process. So, and I know self-ratings are used in some forms, and I know that over the last year, since this issue surfaced, I think in our webinar last year, or might have been 2 years ago, a number of units have removed self-ratings from their form.
Okay.
Because in some ways it's kind of common sense. It's going to create defensiveness, and it doesn't really add a lot of value. But because it's a complicated process, it's not always easy to just remove something from a form that hundreds or thousands of people use. So, I would say that's one where if you have that in your form, be ready to have a little bit of defensiveness in that conversation. And don't be surprised by it, but try to move past it. Don't dwell on it. Don't, spend a lot of time trying to defend your rating and explain why the employee's rating isn't what it is. And that's where I think it's about trying not to get too distracted or spend too much time on something. But you probably have to do it, at least for now. But then long term, I would say raise this issue. Raise this issue with your HR team, who they're part of this talent and performance management working group that we're doing. So all of the HR professionals across the system right now, we're all looking into how we can improve performance management. So make your voice heard.
Great. Yeah. So I think that's a perfect question that kind of led into what you were talking about earlier. Great, Betsy, I hope that's helpful, and the other supervisors who are also dealing with that situation. Another question that came through, this is from, oh, great, Betsy. Thanks for the feedback. Another question that came through, this is just a clarification question, I think, from Matt, but what do we mean when we say local? I think we mentioned this earlier about performance management and how it's determined on a local level. Does anyone want to speak to
I think
a way to answer
I would just repeat maybe what I said, that it's determined at the college or unit level, but in some cases multiple units have gotten together. So you may share a system with other units, but it is ultimately determined at that level.
Thank you. Anything else to add? Another person's asking about clarifying SMART goals. So the question was, that SMART goals were the way to go. What is it, and I mentioned this in the webinar earlier, if any of you wanted to talk to this, why is it that SMART goals aren't always the way to go? Why don't they work?
I can try that one, and you guys can chime in if you want. One thing about the SMART goals, and I think they're good as far as it goes, but what can happen is we can get so focused on developing goals, especially at the outset of the year. And those goals can so quickly change as new things come up. I mean, it's just sort of assumed that things are moving along at a pretty fast pace. And so that's why I think folks have been talking about doing carefully, crafted, more broad goals. And then, I don't know, Brandon, is there anything else you want to say about the measurement piece of it?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
I could add another kind of framework. Could be simple goals, so it's making sure that the goals are specific, important, and measurable. But it's really more focusing on what does the employee need to be working on, and making sure that they have a clear understanding about what success looks like for their role.
Yeah, I just want to kind of underscore what we were talking about, that things shift and change so quickly. We want to be flexible and adaptable in our goals, and that's why it's important to have that constant communication with employees in terms of.
Thanks, you guys. Great.
Okay. Yeah, there's a one question that I want to address, because it's something that comes up a lot, and it's another practice that could be put in place locally, and some units do this. So the question is, how do you deal with supervisors who rate all or most of their employees as exceptional? And this is something that happens a lot of times. I mean, it's kind of in human nature, the people who report to you, we tend to over-evaluate them. I mean, it's a bias that people have. And this is why a lot of organizations do what's called calibration. And this is a best practice, and it works well when it's done well. And this is usually something that is facilitated or led by a human resource business partner. But the idea is that because supervisors tend to over-evaluate their direct reports, you have a process you go through where you meet with groupings of supervisors. So if it's, let's say, within a unit, all of the managers in that unit or all the directors in that unit would sit down and go through a systematic process of talking through the ratings that they're giving and the rationale for those ratings. And then there's discussion among the group, and that discussion may be challenging those ratings or offering other information about different employees, offering different perspectives. And then the idea is, by the end of that, you've calibrated so that all of the supervisors are using the same criteria. And then, that often will, coming out of calibration, you will make adjustments to those ratings. And so if a supervisor comes into that, they're giving everybody the maximum rating, they better be ready to explain why every single one of their direct reports deserves that rating. And that creates a much more, kind of a more equitable, more objective process. And my observation is that is done some places at the university, but many places it is not. And that's the best way to address that issue.
Thanks, Brandon. I think we have time for one more question before we go into our final announcements. This is a question from Jennifer. If a supervisee, and this is probably a very common type of question, is if a supervisee is resistant to meeting weekly and their past behavior suggests they fear conflict and feedback, should I recommend they participate in training or workshop on conflict management? So I think the question really here is, I'm trying to make these weekly or these check-ins happen, and I'm getting some kind of resistance to this from my direct report. So what do you have any recommendations for how a supervisor should proceed with something like this, or what they should be keeping in mind? I think there's lots of ways to answer the question.
No,
so what comes to mind?
Yeah, I'll weigh in, and then if you guys want to add anything. So my question back to the supervisor is, how is it, and I mean this in the most respectful way, how is it that your employee can determine if they're going to meet with you or not? I mean, I think as a supervisor, you get to call the meeting with your employee, and so to kind of feel empowered in that. And I get, sometimes people will do pushbacks, but it's important to discuss what they're working on, what their goals are, to ensure that they're meeting them. And I think this is one where the supervisor will want to kind of prepare how he's going to approach it.
Good
he or
point.
she.
So going back to that preparation,
Yeah.
and then just kind of doing your best to say, if not today, then tomorrow, this is going to happen.
Yeah, and I
Very,
think
very
just
challenging.
feel empowered that you can do it.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Anything to add to that?
Well, I think that it's an expectation that you as a supervisor will set, is you think about what kind of routine makes sense given your direct reports and the work. Is a half hour a week what works for you, or an hour a month? I mean, there's different things that work. Mm-hmm. But once you decide what works for you, then setting that expectation with all of your direct reports and having those discussions is part of the job. And I would say that in my experience, it's pretty rare that employees don't want to have that kind of time. And when they don't, it often means that there is something wrong. Sometimes it's a performance problem that they know is there, but that maybe you as a supervisor you haven't really addressed it, and so they're kind of afraid every time they meet with you, you're going to bring it up. That happens a lot when there's this sort of situation. Other times, employees may not know, what do I use my manager for, right? I'm doing my work, it's going well, why do I need to talk to my supervisor about this? And so that's something where that actually happens a lot. And when that happens, then you can have a discussion about the purpose of the check-ins. It might be helpful to put in place a specific, agenda that's flexible, but that provides some structure and some, kind of answers the question of, well, why are we meeting on a regular basis? And then, the way that it works with high performers typically is that they actually are the ones that bring the agenda to the one-on-one, right? They come in because they're thinking, okay, in order for me to be successful, what do I need my supervisor to help me with? What do I need their input on? What barriers do I need them to help me remove to get my work done? So actually, that's kind of where you want to get to with a lot of employees. Now, not every job is going to be like that, but in a lot of jobs, that's a place you want to get to.
Great, thanks. So I hope that was helpful, kind of thinking about the different ways you can approach an issue like that. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to cut short the Q&A at this point. Thank you everyone for submitting your questions. There's some really good questions in there. We will answer them and we'll post them into our Q&A on the website, and we'll let you know when we do that. At this point, there are a few announcements before we end the session. One of the questions that came up today was, where do we find the quick guide? And the quick guide, so the site that you see in front of you, supervising.umn.edu, this is the place you can go to find quick guides for any of the modules, any of the topics in SDC, including the ones that we talked about today. So we were going through this content rather quickly today, and as a reminder, this webinar is only meant to whet your appetite. So to learn more, again, you can explore the Supervisory Development website at supervising.umn.edu, where we have the quick guides that you can download for your reference. For today's module, you can check out Module 2, Managing and Evaluating Performance. Specifically, take a look at the quick guide to goal setting, which walks through some important steps of how to set effective goals. In addition, for more information about check-ins, take a look at our check-in template found on the SDC site. So this is kind of exciting, but as we are constantly looking for ways to make SDC content more convenient for you to use in your own development, all of the supervisory development webinars are available as podcasts. so you can listen wherever and whenever it's convenient for you, during your commute, walking on campus, or when you're at home. Each podcast is about 45 minutes long. You can find them at z.umn.edu/SDC podcasts. If you haven't already on your action sheet at this point, I think this is the last question there, can you indicate one thing you can commit to doing to make your performance management experiences more effective? And this is kind of your concrete takeaway, or at least your concrete effort. Thanks everyone for your attendance today. We hope you find this information useful and relevant to your performance management processes. We look forward to talking with you again soon.